She never expected to find proof. For years, rumors had circulated about what really happened behind the closed doors of the nation's most powerful religious institutions, but Isa Marshall was about to uncover evidence that would shake the foundations of modern faith communities forever. She'd spent 3 years tracking whispers and connecting seemingly unrelated threads across dozens of religious institutions. What began as research for a simple exposé on financial corruption had led her down a rabbit hole she never anticipated. The patterns she uncovered pointed to something far more disturbing: systematic rituals hidden within certain branches of Western religious leadership. These weren't just isolated incidents of hypocrisy or moral failings that occasionally made headlines. Something organized, ancient, and deliberately concealed was happening. Something that contradicted every public teaching these leaders espoused. The weight of what she was uncovering kept her awake at night, questioning if she should continue. But Isa knew that truth, however uncomfortable, needed to come to light. She'd grown up trusting these institutions, donating her time and family's money to their causes. The personal betrayal fueled her determination to follow the evidence wherever it led. The first red flag appeared when Isa noticed unusual financial transfers between certain religious organizations and remote properties. Nothing illegal on the surface, just periodic gatherings labeled as leadership retreats or spiritual renewal conferences. But the amounts spent seemed excessive, and the locations were invariably isolated, protected from curious eyes. What struck her as odd was the pattern. These gatherings followed ancient pagan calendars rather than Christian ones. They aligned perfectly with solstices, equinoxes, and other celestial events that predated Christianity. When she cross-referenced attendees, she found the same core group of senior religious figures attended every gathering, regardless of their denominational differences. These were men who publicly criticized each other's theological positions, yet privately gathered together in secret. The contradiction was glaring, but still circumstantial. Isa needed more if she was going to risk her reputation on such explosive allegations. The breakthrough came when she convinced a groundskeeper at one retreat center to speak with her. His account of preparing the facilities for these gatherings included details that made no sense for a Christian leadership conference: specialized rooms, ritual objects carefully transported in and out, and strict instructions about privacy. Most tellingly, he mentioned the strange symbols temporarily installed, then removed afterward. Symbols the man didn't recognize, but Isa immediately identified from her research into ancient fertility cults. What troubled Isa most wasn't just the hypocrisy, it was the calculated deception. These weren't men struggling with private vices that contradicted their public teachings. This was an organized system operating within the very institutions claiming moral authority over millions. The evidence suggested these rituals had continued uninterrupted for centuries, passed down through carefully selected initiates. The public personas these leaders cultivated, the books on family values, the sermons on purity, the political advocacy, all served as perfect cover. Who would suspect such elaborate contradictory behavior? And more importantly, who would believe accusations against men who had positioned themselves as moral authorities? Isa realized why previous attempts to expose fragments of this system had failed. Anyone coming forward with partial information appeared delusional when confronting such respected figures. The system protected itself through its sheer audacity and the social capital of its participants. But Isa had something previous investigators lacked: a methodical approach and an understanding of historical context that connected seemingly isolated incidents into a clear pattern. Still, she knew she needed irrefutable evidence before going public, the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Her research led her to Professor James Calloway, a religious historian who'd spent decades studying the intersection of pagan traditions and early Christianity. Though initially reluctant to speak with a journalist, the professor's reservations dissolved when Isa shared her findings. "You've independently confirmed what I've only theorized," he admitted, visibly shaken. "These aren't random adoptions of ancient practices. This is an unbroken lineage." The professor explained how certain pre-Christian fertility rituals had been secretly preserved within religious institutions, hidden in plain sight, through coded language and selective initiation. According to his research, these practices were believed to channel divine energy and confer special powers on participants. "What makes this particularly disturbing," he continued, "isn't just the deception, but the hierarchical aspect. These rituals are designed to create spiritual stratification, to separate the truly initiated from ordinary believers. Issa felt a chill as she realized the implications. These weren't just hypocritical religious leaders. This was a deliberate system of control and power operating within trusted institutions. What she couldn't yet determine was how widespread the network had become, or how the participants justified such profound contradiction. Armed with historical context from Professor Calloway, Issa began looking for contemporary evidence. She meticulously compiled financial records, property deeds, travel itineraries, and scheduling patterns. She created a database tracking the movements of suspected participants over the past decade. The pattern was undeniable: regular gatherings at specific locations following the ancient calendar. But documentation of what actually occurred remained elusive. None of the participants would speak with her, and those who worked at the facilities were bound by strict confidentiality agreements. Issa needed an insider, someone who had participated and was willing to break ranks. Finding such a person seemed impossible until she received an anonymous email containing only a phone number and the words, "I want out." The message came in response to a carefully worded query she had posted on a religious studies forum, intentionally designed to signal her awareness of the rituals without explicitly stating it. Whoever sent this was taking an enormous risk. Issa stared at her phone for nearly an hour before making the call, knowing that this conversation could either break her investigation wide open or lead her down a dangerous path of misinformation. The voice on the other end belonged to Michael Harrington, a mid-level administrator in one of the country's largest evangelical organizations. "I can't meet in person," he insisted, audible fear in his voice. "They have resources you can't imagine. Eyes everywhere." Issa arranged an encrypted video call instead, with Michael using a series of security measures that seemed excessive until he explained his situation. "I was brought in 5 years ago," he began, his voice shaking slightly. At first it seemed like a special honor, being invited to exclusive leadership gatherings. "I was told these retreats represented the deeper traditions of faith, reserved for those ready for higher understanding." Michael described a gradual initiation process that began with seemingly innocent rituals that became increasingly disturbing. "They frame everything in scriptural language to justify it, but what happens has nothing to do with the faith they preach publicly." He explained how participants rationalized their actions through elaborate theological frameworks that twisted religious texts beyond recognition. "The deeper you go, the more you're compromised, the more you have to lose if you speak out. It's the perfect trap." Participants believed they were tapping into divine energy that empowered their public ministries. "The most disturbing part," Michael continued, "is how they select new initiates. They look for specific psychological profiles, people who desire power but can compartmentalize effectively. This explained the system's longevity. Participants were carefully chosen for their ability to maintain the deception. Michael agreed to provide documentation, meeting minutes obscured with coded language, financial records, and most importantly, a schedule of upcoming gatherings. What he couldn't offer was direct evidence of the rituals themselves. "Everything electronic is forbidden during ceremonies. No recordings exist, by design." Issa realized she would need to document these events herself if she wanted irrefutable proof. The question was how to gain access to such carefully guarded proceedings. The opportunity came through an unexpected source: Rachel Winters, the daughter of a prominent religious leader. She had contacted Issa after reading one of her previous investigative pieces. "My father isn't who he pretends to be," she wrote. "I've suspected for years that something isn't right." Rachel described growing up with a father who was virtually absent, despite his public focus on family values. She recalled strange phone calls, secretive meetings, and discovering odd symbolic objects among her father's possessions. Most tellingly, she'd noticed how her father's behavior changed dramatically after returning from certain leadership conferences. Rachel had access to her father's schedule and correspondence through a shared family calendar she helped manage. She could provide Issa with insider information about the next gathering, security protocols, facility layout, and potential access points. With Rachel's help, Issa developed a plan. She would pose as catering staff for the retreat center where the next major gathering was scheduled. Rachel would ensure her father's recommendation put Issa's name on the approved vendor list. It was dangerous, but it offered the only path to obtaining direct evidence. The remote retreat center was even more isolated than Issa had imagined. Nestled in the mountains of western Montana, the exclusive property spanned hundreds of acres, surrounded by private land with no public access points. Security was tight, but focused primarily on the main entrance and perimeter. As catering staff, Issa had limited but crucial access to the central lodge where participants gathered. For the first 2 days, everything appeared disappointingly ordinary. Lectures, discussion groups, and prayer sessions that aligned with the retreat's public agenda. Issa began to wonder if she'd been mistaken, or if Michael and Rachel had misinterpreted innocent events. But on the third night, everything changed. The regular staff was dismissed early, with only a select few remaining, including Issa, who had volunteered for late cleanup duties. As the sun set, she noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. Participants who had maintained professional distances began to interact differently. There was a palpable shift in energy as the pretense began to drop. Using the service corridors Rachel had identified in the building plans, Issa positioned herself where she could observe without being seen. What unfolded before her was both shocking and validating. The group of nearly 30 religious leaders, men who led congregations totaling millions of followers, engaged in rituals that contradicted everything they publicly preached. The ceremony began with traditional elements that could be explained away: incense, candles, symbolic garments. But it quickly evolved into something that defied any conventional religious interpretation. The participants shed their public personas completely, engaging in practices drawn from ancient fertility cults. Issa documented everything with a specialized camera designed for low-light conditions. The images were undeniable, showing clearly identifiable religious leaders participating in rituals they would publicly condemn. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. These were the same men who built careers condemning behaviors they now embraced in secret. But beyond the hypocrisy was something more disturbing: the calculated nature of the deception and the absolute confidence with which they operated. What Issa witnessed wasn't simply moral failure or hypocrisy. It was an organized system operating within trusted institutions. The participants moved through the rituals with practiced precision, suggesting years of involvement. She recognized elements from her research: symbols, movements, and patterns that connected directly to ancient fertility practices. But they had been adapted, modernized, and incorporated into a framework that these leaders could rationalize to themselves. The most disturbing aspect was how they referenced their public teachings during the ceremony, explicitly acknowledging the contradiction and seeming to draw power from the deception itself. Issa felt physically ill watching men who had built media empires on family values and moral purity engage in behaviors that violated every principle they espoused. She forced herself to continue documenting, knowing this evidence would be essential. What she couldn't capture was the psychology behind such profound contradiction, how these men justified their actions to themselves and each other. The gathering concluded shortly before dawn, with participants dispersing to their private rooms. Issa slipped away, her documentation secure in encrypted storage. She needed to leave immediately before anyone realized what she had witnessed. Her heart pounded as she made her way through the service exit Rachel had identified as the least monitored. The pre-dawn air felt electric with both danger and vindication. Everything she had suspected was true, and now she had proof. But with that proof came immediate danger. These were powerful men with resources and influence. They had built careers on moral authority that her evidence would destroy. Issa had no illusions about what they might do to protect themselves. She needed to secure her evidence and herself before moving forward. As she drove down the mountain road, putting distance between herself and the retreat center, she mentally reviewed her safety protocols. The material was backed up on encrypted servers that would automatically release to selected journalists if she didn't check in regularly. She had legal counsel prepared for what would undoubtedly be brutal attempts to discredit her. Back in her temporary apartment, Issa examined the evidence she'd gathered. The images were clear, the identities of participants unmistakable. Combined with the financial records, scheduling patterns, and testimony from Michael and Rachel, she had assembled an airtight case. The rituals these leaders engaged in weren't just hypocritical. They represented a complete inversion of their public teachings. More disturbing was how the ceremonies specifically incorporated elements of their public personas into the rituals, suggesting they derived particular satisfaction from the contradiction. This wasn't simple human weakness or moral failure. It was deliberate deception elevated to a spiritual practice. These men had built media empires, political influence, and vast financial networks based on moral authority they clearly didn't believe in themselves. Millions of people shaped their lives around teachings that the leaders themselves secretly rejected. The betrayal was staggering in its scope and implications. Isa realized she wasn't just exposing individual hypocrisy, she was challenging an entire system of power and influence. As Isa prepared her investigation for publication, unexpected allies emerged from within religious communities. Theologians, historians, and religious scholars who had noticed fragments of the pattern over decades reached out with additional context and support. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a religious historian, provided crucial analysis. What you've uncovered isn't new. It's the continuation of a pattern that has recurred throughout religious history. Whenever spiritual institutions gain significant power, secretive contradictory practices tend to emerge among leadership. This historical context helped Isa frame her investigation not as an attack on faith itself, but on the corrupting influence of power and secrecy. Other religious leaders, genuinely disturbed by her findings, offered public support, emphasizing that true faith had nothing to fear from exposing deception. Their voices would be essential in the coming storm, as they could speak with spiritual authority about why such hypocrisy was so damaging. Isa carefully incorporated their perspectives, ensuring her investigation couldn't be dismissed as anti-religious bias. The day before publication, Isa received a threatening message that made her blood run cold. "We know what you have. We know where you are. This can end one of two ways." The message included personal details that proved they were watching her closely. Rather than intimidating her, the threat confirmed she was on the right track and strengthened her resolve. She immediately implemented her security protocols, moving to a safe location and alerting her legal team. She also accelerated the publication timeline, working with her editor to release the investigation that evening, rather than waiting until morning. As the hours counted down, Isa experienced alternating waves of anxiety and determination. What she was about to publish would destroy careers, shake institutions, and force millions of followers to reconsider their trust in religious leadership. The potential for backlash was enormous, but she also knew that truth, however painful, was necessary for healing and reform. Real faith didn't require deception or hypocrisy. Whatever happened next, she was bringing light to darkness that had remained hidden for far too long. The investigation broke like a thunderclap across media platforms. Sacred deception, inside the secret rituals of religious leadership, detailed everything Isa had uncovered, supported by irrefutable evidence. Within hours, the story was picked up by major news outlets globally. The identified participants responded with the expected denials, threats of legal action, and attempts to discredit Isa. But the evidence was too comprehensive, too meticulously documented to dismiss. Additional victims and witnesses, emboldened by the publication, began coming forward with their own experiences, further validating Isa's reporting. Religious communities experienced profound shock and betrayal. Congregations held emergency meetings, trying to process what this meant for their faith. Many distinguished between the corruption of certain leaders and the validity of their own spiritual beliefs. Others faced deeper crises of faith, questioning how they could have been deceived for so long. In some communities, the revelations sparked renewed commitment to transparency and accountability in religious leadership. In the weeks following publication, the consequences unfolded rapidly. Several exposed leaders resigned immediately, while others attempted to fight the allegations despite overwhelming evidence. Legal investigations were launched into financial improprieties connected to the secret gatherings. Religious organizations scrambled to implement new accountability measures and transparency protocols. The broader conversation shifted from shock to reflection on how such systematic deception could have continued for so long. Experts in psychology, sociology, and religious studies offered frameworks for understanding how power and secrecy create environments where such contradictions can flourish. Most importantly, survivors who had tried to speak out previously and been silenced finally received validation. Their stories, once dismissed as unbelievable, now made perfect sense in light of Isa's investigation. For many, this validation began a healing process after years of being told they were lying or delusional. For Isa, the aftermath brought professional recognition, but also personal challenges. Death threats arrived daily. Several of the exposed leaders filed defamation lawsuits despite the solid evidence. Right-wing media outlets attempted to portray her as anti-religion rather than pro-accountability. The pressure was intense, but she found unexpected support from religious communities themselves. Reform-minded believers saw her work as necessary purification rather than an attack. "What you've done has wounded the church," one prominent theologian told her, "but it's the wound a surgeon inflicts to remove cancer." 6 months after publication, Issa was invited to speak at a conference on religious reform and accountability. Standing before an audience of clergy, theologians, and ordinary believers, she reflected on the investigation's impact. "This was never about attacking faith," she explained. "It was about the universal principle that truth matters, that leaders should embody the values they preach, and that power without accountability inevitably corrupts." Without the shadow of hypocrisy and deception, genuine conversations about faith, ethics, and spiritual practice flourished. New leadership emerged, committed to transparency and consistency between public teaching and private behavior. Perhaps the greatest lesson, Issa noted in her follow-up article 1 year later, is that authentic faith has nothing to fear from truth. When deception is removed, what remains has the opportunity to be more genuine. The investigation had cost her nearly 4 years of her life, subjected her to threats and litigation, and changed her understanding of how power operates in religious institutions. But seeing the positive changes emerging in religious communities made the sacrifice worthwhile. What had begun as an investigation into corruption had become a catalyst for reformation and renewal. The systems of power and deception weren't fully dismantled. Such deep-rooted problems never disappear completely, but they had been exposed to light, allowing for accountability and change. The most meaningful responses came from ordinary people whose faith had been exploited by the exposed leaders. Thousands wrote to Issa sharing how the investigation had freed them from spiritual manipulation and allowed them to reclaim their faith on more authentic terms. "I almost abandoned my beliefs entirely," one woman wrote, "but your reporting helped me see the difference between corrupt leaders and the principles they betrayed." Issa compiled these stories into a book, After the Fall, Reclaiming Faith from Corrupt Leadership, which became an unexpected guide for communities healing from religious trauma. Religious scholars noted historical parallels, how exposures of corruption often preceded periods of significant spiritual renewal and reformation. "What we're witnessing," wrote Dr. Samuel Rodriguez, "follows a pattern seen throughout religious history. Periods of institutional corruption, once exposed, frequently give way to authentic spiritual revivals focused on returning to core principles." Issa took no credit for this renewal, seeing herself merely as the messenger who brought necessary truth to light. 3 years after the investigation, Issa returned to St. Augustine Seminary, where her journey had begun. The institution had undergone dramatic reforms, implementing unprecedented transparency measures and accountability structures. New leadership had severed ties with the exposed network and recommitted to authentic spiritual formation. Walking through the same archives where she'd first noticed discrepancies in financial records, Issa reflected on the nature of institutional change. Corruption and deception could take root in any organization where power concentrated without accountability. But exposure, while painful, created possibility for renewal and transformation. The seminary's president, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, invited Issa to speak to students about ethical leadership and journalistic integrity. "Your work caused an earthquake in our world, Doctor," Jenkins acknowledged, "but from that upheaval something more authentic is emerging." Standing before future religious leaders, Issa emphasized the responsibility that came with spiritual authority. "The people who trust you deserve leaders whose private convictions align with public teachings. Integrity isn't just an abstract virtue. It's the foundation of any healthy spiritual community." Working with religious historians and anthropologists, she traced the practices to ancient fertility cults that had been secretly preserved within certain branches of religious leadership. What made these rituals particularly attractive to those in power was their fundamental inversion of public religious teachings. The contradiction itself was the point, creating a psychological mechanism that allowed leaders to feel superior to the rules they imposed on others. "The appeal wasn't primarily sexual," explained Dr. Calloway, who had continued researching the historical connections. "It was about power, specifically the intoxicating power of living above the moral constraints imposed on followers. This dynamic explained why the system had survived for centuries, despite occasional exposures of individual participants. The psychological rewards of such double lives were powerful enough to outweigh the risks, especially when combined with the community's tendency to disbelieve accusations against trusted leaders. Understanding these mechanisms became essential for preventing similar systems from re-emerging. What became clear through Issa's continued research was that the exposed rituals weren't isolated anomalies but symptoms of a deeper pattern. What happens when any belief system becomes primarily about power rather than its original principles? Throughout history, whenever spiritual teachings became entwined with political influence and financial gain, similar contradictions tended to emerge. The leaders she had exposed weren't uniquely evil. They were ordinary people corrupted by systems that rewarded deception and compartmentalization. This understanding didn't excuse their behavior, but provided essential context for preventing recurrence. True reform required more than removing corrupt individuals. It demanded structural changes that created transparency, distributed power more widely, and rewarded consistency between belief and action. Some religious communities embraced these reforms wholeheartedly, implementing oversight mechanisms and flattening hierarchical structures. Others resisted change, insisting the exposed leaders were anomalies rather than symptoms of systemic problems. The contrast between these approaches would become increasingly evident in the years that followed. 5 years after her investigation, Issa published Sacred Power: The Psychology of Religious Corruption and Reform, examining how the dynamics she had uncovered operated across different religious traditions and historical periods. The book became required reading in seminaries and religious studies programs, helping future leaders recognize warning signs of corruption. Issa herself had moved beyond investigating religious institutions specifically, applying similar methods to examining power dynamics in political and corporate settings. The tools she had developed for recognizing systematic deception proved equally valuable across different domains. What sustained her through difficult investigations was the knowledge that truth, however uncomfortable, created possibility for genuine transformation. She never set out to become an expert in religious corruption or institutional reform. That path had found her through a combination of journalistic instinct, moral conviction, and simple persistence. Looking back, she wouldn't have chosen any other journey, despite its challenges and dangers. In bringing hidden truth to light, she had helped create space for something more authentic to emerge. The lasting impact of Issa's investigation was not the downfall of corrupt leaders, but the transformation of the communities they had led. In many congregations, exposing the contradiction between public teaching and private practice created opportunity for more authentic approaches to faith. What emerged wasn't the death of religion, but its renewal, noted Professor Ellen Rodriguez in her analysis of the aftermath. Communities forced to confront deception often rebuild on foundations of greater authenticity and transparency. This pattern repeated across different denominations and traditions, though the specific forms of renewal varied widely. Some communities embraced more democratic governance structures, distributing authority more broadly. Others recommitted to their original principles while implementing rigorous accountability mechanisms. The most successful reformations acknowledge both individual and systemic factors in corruption, addressing both simultaneously. For ordinary believers, the process was often painful, but ultimately liberating, allowing them to reclaim spiritual practices that had been tainted by association with exposed hypocrisy. What Issa could never have anticipated was how her investigation would influence her own spiritual journey. Raised in a religious household before becoming disillusioned as a young adult, she had maintained professional detachment throughout her reporting, but witnessing both the corruption and the genuine renewal that followed its exposure reopened questions she had set aside years earlier. The most unexpected outcome, she admitted in a rare personal interview, was finding my way back to certain spiritual practices, freed from the corruption that had tainted them. She began quietly exploring contemplative traditions, drawn to approaches that emphasized direct experience over hierarchical authority. Her journey wasn't toward any specific denomination, but toward authentic engagement with questions of meaning, purpose, and transcendence. The investigation had brought her full circle, from childhood faith through disillusionment to a more nuanced understanding that distinguished between corrupt systems and the genuine human needs they exploited. This personal evolution informed her ongoing work, allowing her to approach future investigations with both critical rigor and deeper compassion. When we confront corruption in sacred spaces, we face our deepest cultural contradictions, Issa wrote in the conclusion to her final book on the subject. How we respond reveals not just who we are, but who we aspire to become. The exposure of secret rituals had initiated conversations about power, accountability, and authenticity that extended far beyond religious contexts. Academic researchers studied the case as a model of investigative journalism that triggered systemic reform. Religious leaders referenced it when implementing accountability structures. Ordinary people drew inspiration from it when confronting deception in their own communities. The story had transcended its specific details to become a template for how truth, however difficult, creates possibility for transformation. For Issa, this broader impact represented the true success of her work, not just exposing what was hidden, but helping create conditions for something better to emerge. The investigation had required tremendous sacrifice and courage, but the changes it catalyzed made those costs worthwhile. 10 years after her investigation, Issa Marshall received the Pulitzer Prize for her body of work examining power and accountability across different institutions. In her acceptance speech, she reflected on what sustained her through difficult and dangerous investigations. "The pursuit of truth is never merely destructive," she observed. "When we expose deception, we create space for authenticity. When we challenge corrupt systems, we make room for more just alternatives." Her investigation into religious corruption had indeed destroyed careers and shaken institutions, but it had also catalyzed reforms that benefited millions and created space for more authentic spiritual communities to flourish. The exposed leaders had been replaced by a new generation committed to transparency and consistency between teaching and practice. Religious organizations had implemented accountability structures that made similar corruption more difficult. Ordinary believers had reclaimed their traditions on more authentic terms. This pattern of destruction and renewal echoed ancient wisdom traditions that recognized how endings create possibility for new beginnings. For Issa, this regenerative cycle represented both the cost and promise of truth-telling in a world that often preferred comfortable deception.